We should be on chapters 7 and 8 this week in the textbook. Chapter 7 should be mostly review. It's about unemployment. Chapter 8 is the beginning of the solo model. I'm going to post some links to the Marginal Revolution University videos about the solo model. That will be a more simple version of the solo model than what you're going to get in the MAMQ. But it'll get you familiar with the ideas. So when things start getting confusing, you can refer back to that and look at it. You may have studied the solo model in your intro course. You might not have. I don't know. I usually include it because I think it's an interesting model. But I think it's going to be important for you to have that background. And I think that those videos would be a good way to do it. The beginning of your textbook on chapter 7 starts with a quote from a guy named Thomas Carlyle. An interesting and important public intellectual in Great Britain around the same time as John Stuart Mill, the great political economist. Now, Carlyle is the dude who didn't like economists. He didn't like the entire field of political economy. You guys remember why he didn't like political economy? Because political economy said slavery is bad. And Carlyle wanted to preserve slavery. Why? Well, mostly because it made him better off. Okay? And Carlyle, in the complaining about the role of political economy in the abolition of slavery, is the guy who called economics the dismal science. And he thought it was dismal because it was pro-abolition. So I wear the badge, dismal scientist, as a badge of honor, because I am also pro-abolition, anti-slavery. Okay, so unemployment sucks. Everybody can pretty much agree about that. But why is there a presumption that the government should do something about it? Or why does macroeconomics have this entire field or sub-discipline studying labor economics and unemployment in particular? Now, we want to study labor economics just to understand the exchange relation that occurs in a labor contract. That's understandable. But what about unemployment? Big picture, right? We can think about economic growth as having some trajectory like this, but it's not a smooth trajectory, is it? No, there are swings. There are times of expansion and times of recession. Right? And if this recession gets really bad, what do we call it? A depression. Right? A recession is when somebody you know loses their job. A depression is when you lose your job. Right? But what is the political ramification of a depression? Why does politics, and macro is really about politics, why does politics get involved when there's unemployment? Well, when people are unemployed, one, they don't have anything to do with their time. Two, they don't feel good. They're suffering. And so oftentimes they look to the government as the source of their problems. Now, that doesn't necessarily just mean, oh, this particular politician is the problem, or this particular policy is the problem. In the extreme, people will look at the situation and say, the government is the problem. In other words, they'll try to overthrow the government. And I may have mentioned this before, but John Maynard Keynes, in the middle of the Great Depression, was looking at the situation, realizing, gosh, a lot of people are becoming fascists right now. And a lot of people are becoming communists right now. And he was living in liberal, democratic-ish Great Britain at the time, and he did not want to see Great Britain become a purely socialist or a purely fascist state like some of the countries around him. So he was concerned about that. The political motivation for getting involved is strong if you happen to be benefiting currently from the current governance structure or from those who are in power. You might want to preserve it. And so it is the elites within government that are trying to preserve whatever power and position they hold. They're going to want to address the problem of unemployment because if they don't, they might not hold that position of elitism anymore. Am I making sense to you? Okay. So our textbook addresses the problem of unemployment, and even though there is that swing, we see that there is a rate of unemployment. Now, if I'm going to draw the unemployment change here, sometimes unemployment is around 3%, and that's very, very rarely. Sometimes unemployment gets to 15%. So unemployment also follows a jagged trajectory, doesn't it? By the way, does unemployment ever get below 0%? Not in the way that we calculate it. But what if everybody had 2 jobs? I guess that would be negative unemployment. We just don't see that ever because we don't calculate having 2 jobs. Okay? Unemployment gets really high in the Great Depression. Unemployment gets really high again in the early 1980s. And right now, unemployment is through the roof. Well, actually, it's back down again now, isn't it? For a minute there, unemployment hit 30%, I think. We're back to around 8 or 9% right now. Okay, so there is a question about, well, how much unemployment is good and how much unemployment is bad. Right? We could try to get lower unemployment rates, but whenever we enact a policy to do one thing, there's always an opportunity cost. There's no solutions, there's only trade-offs. No solutions, only trade-offs. And so the problem is, well, what are the relevant trade-offs involved? Again, thinking about the trend of economic growth, by trying to mute the problems of recessions, in particular unemployment in this case, we could also end up muting the overall trend of economic growth. We could have something like stagflation, where economic growth has slowed down because the policies that we put in place have discouraged the motivators of economic growth. So then we try to figure out, is there a level of unemployment that is normal, that is healthy? And to try to understand the healthy level of unemployment, what we're really looking for is something called the natural rate of unemployment. I think it's strange to use the word natural. Does natural mean correct? Appropriate? What do we mean by natural? Do we mean how many cows are unemployed? Not nature. How many owls are currently unemployed? No. By natural, we mean a sustainable and normal level. Okay. And Adam Smith actually used the word natural in sort of the same way. Some people took it to mean that he meant the correct measure of something, but really what he was using that term to mean was, this is what we can expect to see in the real world. Ceteris paribus. So what is the natural rate of unemployment? It changes. For a long time, people said that 6% unemployment was the natural rate of unemployment. And then we experienced a long period of time where unemployment was lower than 6%. Okay, do we change our understanding of what the natural rate of unemployment is? We would have to. And then we saw a time period where the rate of unemployment was steadily holding at 8%, and the economy was still growing. Okay, well maybe then the natural rate of unemployment is higher. How do we decide? The textbook builds a small model. They give us a couple of variables. And again, why do we use these algebraic models? So that we can then take it to the data and use empirical data to verify our hypotheses about how things are working. So we're going to use L to indicate the labor force. We're going to use E to talk about the people who are employed. We're going to use U to indicate people that are unemployed. We'll use F to indicate the rate of job finding. The rate at which people are finding jobs. And then we'll use S, little s, to indicate the rate at which people are being separated from their jobs. Or that they're losing their jobs. And the idea is that if we take the rate at which people are finding jobs and multiply that by the unemployment rate, the number of people who are unemployed rather, that should be equal to the rate at which people are being separated from their jobs times the number of people who are employed. We can test this, right? We can say that, well, suppose that people who are currently unemployed and are looking for a job in a given period of time, and that's important to note here, that all this is happening within a measured period of time. If perhaps half of all of the people this month that are looking for a job find a job next month, and let's say that the number of people who are unemployed is 2 million people, then it should also be the case that about 10% of people, I could have put 50% here, about 10% of people are being separated from their jobs if there are 10 million people employed. The idea here is that 1 million is equal to 1 million. Okay? So the churn is relatively constant. Now, what is the current rate of churn of jobs, or what was it pre-COVID? It was about, oh gosh, this is wrong. I think it was about 4 million people every month churned through jobs. So about 4 million people became separated from their jobs, and about 4 million people found a job. On net, through most of the last expansionary period, almost every month, 200,000 net new jobs were being created. So at the end of every month, 200,000 more people had a job than didn't have a job. Okay? But about 4 million people are churning in and out of jobs. Why might you churn in or out of a job? Well, some people quit their jobs and go back to school. Some people quit their jobs because they hate their boss. Some people quit their jobs because they decide to get married and they're going to move across the country with their new spouse. There's a gazillion different reasons, right, why you might be separated from a job. Some people get fired. It happens. Okay, so there's a lot of reasons why you might get unemployed, but once you become unemployed, you start looking for a job. If you're skilled, it's probable that you're going to find a new job within another month. And so most people who do become unemployed every month also find another job, at least within the next couple of months. So we can take these variables and this basic model, and we can also take it as a definition that the labor force is equal to the people who are employed and those who are unemployed. That should be a plus. And then we can do some substitution. So we can take this equation and plug this in. First, we would want to rearrange this. We want to solve this for E. So E is equal to L minus U. And then we're going to substitute the E in here for this. So we get FU equals S times L minus U. Remember here I'm dealing with capital U, indicates the number of people unemployed, not the unemployment rate, just to keep that straight in our minds. Well, we can rearrange this expression in a couple of different ways. First, let's see, how would we want to do this? Let's first divide everything by L. And if I divide everything by L, I get F times U over L equals, and I'm going to distribute that L through. Okay, so I'm going to get S times L over L minus S times U over L. These two L's cancel. And then I can move this term to the other side. So then I have F over U of U over L plus S U over L equals S. And then I can distribute out the F plus S. So I get U over L times F plus S equals S. And then I can divide both sides by F plus S, and I get U over L equals S over F plus S. And then to simplify this a little bit more, I'm going to multiply both the top and bottom of this side by 1 over S, which leaves me with U over L equals 1 over F over S plus 1. And the way your textbook puts this is 1 over 1 plus F over S. That's obviously the same thing. Again, why does our textbook walk us through this algebra, and why do we want to get to this stage? It's so that we can think about what happens if F or S changes to this term. So these are going to be our independent variables, and this is going to be our dependent variable. U over L, the number of people who are unemployed, divided by the labor force, that is our measure of the unemployment rate. Right? We don't include everybody. We only include people who are in the labor force, who either have a job or are looking for a job. Those are the only people we include in the unemployment rate. So then, what happens? This is an expression of the natural rate of unemployment. That is, the number of people who are finding jobs divided by the number of people who are now separated from their jobs. If that can be considered the rate of churn in the economy, right, then we can understand what the natural rate of unemployment is. How would we think about this? What happens if the rate at which people are finding jobs increases while everything else is held constant, or at least while S is being held constant? How would that affect the rate of unemployment? Well, F is in the numerator here of this fraction. It's in the denominator. So as F gets bigger, this denominator gets bigger, which means that the right-hand side becomes smaller, which means that the unemployment rate gets smaller. So as F goes up, U over L goes down. Do you follow that logic? Is this how we're trying to do each of these models? If one variable changes, how does it affect our dependent variable, right? If S goes up, if the rate at which people are being separated from their jobs increases, but we're going to hold the rate at which people are finding jobs constant now. If S gets bigger, then this denominator gets bigger, so this term gets smaller. So then the denominator of this fraction gets smaller, which means that the right-hand side gets bigger, which means that the unemployment rate goes up. So an intuition about how those fractions work is really important for analyzing the mechanics of this model. Any questions about this? Yes?
You said this is a representation of the natural unemployment rate, right?
Right. So given that F and S are determined exogenously from outside of this world, right? They're given, that then determines the unemployment rate. Okay. So, why is there frictional unemployment? Why might there be some level of natural unemployment? Where does frictional unemployment come from? Frictional unemployment might be described by this is how I do it in my intro course, by speed dating, right? A frictional unemployment situation is like speed dating, where a bunch of people all show up and sit at a really long table and check each other out down the line. Maybe Tinder would be a better example at this point. I don't know, is people still using Tinder, or did that go away? Nobody's gonna admit. Okay, good. Then frictional unemployment is you just haven't found somebody to be with right now. You're on the market. You're searching, and there's somebody else out there that's searching. And what if we go to one of those speed dating events and everybody goes home with somebody? Right? Everybody finds somebody, meets somebody. In the short run, right, they don't have a match, but at the end of the night, they do. Okay? If they don't find the right person, maybe they just find Miss or Mr. right now to go home with. Okay. But notice what I described there, though. That long table where everybody came to meet, that was like a market. It was a way of solving the problem of people not having a date. In other words, it was overcoming the transaction cost. Is he going to do transactions costs again? Yep. It is a way of overcoming the transactions costs that are involved in pairing right matches together. And just like we talked about last time with middlemen, or maybe that was on Monday, I talked about middlemen. You'll have to watch the video for that. The transactions costs are really hard to overcome. Finding a good match in many markets, like in dating, like in employment, like in loanable funds, borrowing and lending, can be difficult. Why? Because in dating and in finding a job, you're looking for something very specific. Right? Personal tastes are really important for a job. The different skills that you're going to be required and the personality that somebody is looking for in an employee is very specific. And so it's hard to find just the right thing. It's so hard to find just the right thing, and it's actually quite common that people settle. Most people will settle for a job. Most people will settle for a partner. You'll do for now, right? If you hold out for the perfect person, you just better hope that they're not also holding out for the perfect person. Because you're not it, right? At least. Now, the other problem with that is that if you settle in the short run, when something better comes along, you might bounce, right? And that is part of that frictional unemployment, that people are looking for something better. Because it's hard to match people among jobs, we used to look at the classified ads in the newspaper to see who was hiring. It was an important marketplace, dating table, for finding jobs. Today, we have much lower transactions costs in looking for jobs. And we've got Indeed, we've got Monster, and we've got all these different job finding places that we can use to help us find a job. Now, getting placed in a job that you just settled for is great because you have a job in the short run, you're becoming productive, you're helping a team that's producing something else, you fit a role that that employer was looking for. But it also means that the economy is not quite as productive as it could be. So if we think about the production possibilities frontier, if you have resources that are now allocated to the ultimate optimal thing for them, then you're going to have some resources that are underemployed, and we're going to end up on a lower production possibility frontier. The fact that we allow churn in the labor market is a technology that allows us to achieve, over time, higher production possibility frontiers. Because we allow for churn, because when you get your first job, you're not stuck there for life, because there's no board that's assigning us to what job we're going to have, like in The Giver, right? Because of that, we are all individually allowed to move to better jobs if we can find one that is a better fit for us, especially as we each become more specialized. As the economy is more and more specialized, we're all able to become much more productive with one another. So increased specialization pushes the production possibility from tier out, which is why cities are really great things, provided there's not a pandemic going on. Because within a city, everybody can specialize more specifically into particular niches and do that job really, really well at a lower total average cost, and then trade with others in that economy, going all the way back to basic comparative advantage analysis, right? So through having an allowed churn in the marketplace, we end up moving towards higher productive opportunities in the long run. However, it also means that sometimes you're going to lose a job because the company that you work for goes out of business, or because they need to lay off a whole bunch of people and have a decrease in demand for their product. That means that there's a lot more risk in a market-based economy, a lot more probability that at some point you will become unemployed. We have that as a constant threat in our economy. In good times, it's less likely, or at least if you do become unemployed, it's a lot more likely you'll find another job quickly. But because we allow firms to die, you could die with, or you could at least lose your job with it. Now, again, we're asking ourselves, should the government get involved? And if so, how? What kind of policies can be used? There's a lot more about that later on in the textbook. But I want to throw out there at least this baseline opportunity cost. What would be the baseline alternative to having a job? Anybody ever read My Side of the Mountain? Kid's book about a little kid that goes live up in the mountains during the Great Depression. Right? He was the oldest child in his family, and they were having a hard time feeding their kids. It was during the Great Depression. So he decides to go hitchhike to the Adirondack Mountains in upstate New York and live on his own, live off the land. He gathers acorns and grinds them into a flour that he uses to make pancakes. Did you know you could eat acorns? I didn't know, right? You can eat the roots of cattails. There's a lot of food growing all around us that we don't usually make use of. In other words, the baseline alternative is go make a job. Go live off the land. Go do something, whatever it is, that you would have to do just to be able to survive. Now, what might prevent us from taking that option? Well, if you become unemployed, instead of moving to the mountains and trying to live off the land like the Swiss Family Robinson with the mountain men, right? What might prevent you from doing that is getting unemployment. I give up. Sorry, start over. Unemployment insurance. So this is one government program that provides money to people who have become unemployed. Why might we put unemployment insurance into place? Well, for starters, it's an automatic countercyclical intervention. It doesn't require fiscal or monetary involvement or decision making. So it's an immediate thing that doesn't suffer from lags in policy making. As soon as you become unemployed, you start getting that unemployment insurance. It only really kicks in when a lot of people become unemployed. Why is it good for the individual to be able to get unemployment insurance? It means that you're able to take your time finding a new job. You don't end up just taking whatever next job you can find. Instead, you have a little bit of cushion there to go and try to find another job that is a good fit for you. Now, I became unemployed a couple of times in my life. And at one point, I became unemployed from a job that didn't offer me unemployment insurance. It was a contract position. Right? So I didn't have another alternative. I couldn't get unemployment insurance because I hadn't been laid off. I just lost my contract. Right? So what did I do? Well, I had a car. So I made a job. I started driving for Uber. Right? And I was driving Uber all around Washington, D.C. I would pick up about one economist a day. I meet a lot of interesting people doing that. So there were perks on top of the about $14 an hour that I was earning driving Uber. Okay, so the gig economy has affected unemployment issues because it has created an opportunity for somebody to have a job in the short run while they're also looking for a long-term job. Having some frictional unemployment in the economy helps us to improve our overall productivity. But because our economy is changing dynamically, in order to grow, we also run into the problem of creative destruction. Anyone else familiar with this term, creative destruction? What's that about? Well, when the automobile is invented, what happens to horses? You don't need them as much. When the backhoe is invented, what happens to guys digging with pickaxes and shovels? You don't need them as much. When the steam hammer gets invented, what happens to John Henry? You guys know the song John Henry? If not, Google Johnny Cash, John Henry. It's worth the 8 minutes. Besides, it's Johnny Cash. Creative destruction has to do with dynamic change, where whole industries are collapsing and other new whole industries are being invented and being created. This leads to structural unemployment. What's structural unemployment? It's kind of like getting a divorce. Right? You're all of a sudden on the market again, and you didn't really expect it. It came sort of out of nowhere. Now, it never comes out of nowhere, by the way. There's always things leading up to a divorce, and there's always things leading up to structural unemployment. But what it means is that that set of skills, that pattern of behavior that is very specific to the relationship that you just came out of, doesn't fit with anybody else who's out there right now. The things that you learned about that specific person that you were in a relationship with do not apply to other people. If you tried to apply those things to another person, they would think you were weird and wouldn't be interested. In other words, leaving the stable situation that you were in before, you're going to have to make some changes. Having to make some changes includes like having to become trained in an entire new career. So you get older people going back to school. You get people going back to job training programs. These are programs that the government has put in place to help overcome the problem of structural unemployment. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, it's a normative statement, right? But what we can say is that it helps to support ongoing creative destruction because it provides a cushion for those people who will become unemployed by the dynamic changes that are happening in the marketplace, and it provides an opportunity for them to be trained. Now, if you don't want to have to be stuck in this sort of situation, right, you could be maintaining your skill set so that you are attractive to outside entities at all points in time. I could be running 5 miles a day and be a lot thinner, right? Then I would be much more prepared for any potential new job market. What does that look like in terms of actual jobs? It means that once you graduate from university and go and get your first job, chances are, how long are you going to be in that job? That first job after you graduate? 3 years? Maybe? Maybe a little bit longer, maybe a little bit less. Why? Because getting that first job, the main thing you're demonstrating is you can have a job. You're not an idiot or a lunch tax to the other people that you work with. But right after that, you're going to be looking for another job. And if you're doing really well at your job, other people are going to come looking for you, right? The best way to get a job is to have one. That's where the headhunters find you. But you need to be doing things on top of whatever your job is at that point in time to be prepared. You need to have a side thing. Whatever it is. Could be writing a blog. Could be doing computer research. It could be doing woodworking in your garage. I don't know. But you ought to have something else that you're also doing. A lot of people go to school, get a job, and then pretend like they forgot how to read and never read another book again, right? But when you graduate, if you want to remain competitive, you need to continue reading. A book a month, right? Most Americans read less than 1 book a year. If you're reading a book a month, you're going to be a lot more competitive, no matter what happens in the world. Now, Mankiw is going to contrast two big picture different approaches to macroeconomic policy. He's going to be thinking about the neoclassical model and then the Keynesian model. And that means that, like when we think about our old friends, our aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, right? Long run aggregate supply. The idea is that if something happens to aggregate demand, over the long run, aggregate supply will respond, and eventually we will wind up back at, our real GDP growth rate. The only thing that's going to happen is a change in prices. That's the neoclassical model. The idea being that the market clears on its own. Now, the way that I've shown this, I've shown aggregate demand increasing. But if aggregate demand had started here and decreased, then what would be required is for wages to actually fall in order for us to land back at equilibrium. However, people hate it when their wages go down. People do not like to be in a situation where they're earning less in nominal terms this year than they were last year, because they have sort of a confusion about the distinction between nominal and real. We want inflation to go down and our wages to go up. Right? We want to increase our real purchasing power constantly, don't we? But when inflation goes down and our wages also go down, even if it's by less, we still feel worse off, even though in real terms, we might actually be better off. People don't like that. They call it a monetary illusion. All right? And so Mankiw and others say that there is something like a wage rigidity. And this also comes straight out of Keynes, in which he talks about sticky prices. And the basic understanding of this is just that simply, right, wages are sticky. They won't go down. They aren't freely fluctuating to go downwards. So that if we have in the market for labor a wage and a quantity of labor, and if the supply of labor is relatively constant, the number of workers in the economy is relatively constant, and the demand for labor is described by the amount of jobs available, the jobs that people are willing to be hired for. If for some reason the wage is above the equilibrium wage, what can we say will happen? How do we describe this price scenario? We'll call this a shortage, or actually we call it a surplus, right? A surplus of labor. Because this is the quantity of labor demanded, and this is the quantity of labor supplied. So more is being supplied than demanded, so there's a surplus. In other words, a surplus of labor is unemployment. There's more people willing to work at that wage than there are jobs available at that wage. There are more workers than there are jobs. How can we fix that? Well, we could reduce the going wage so that the market would clear again. But again, wages are rigid. They're sticky upwards. They won't go down. Okay, well, if this is a labor market for a particular skill, job A, what else could happen? If there is a surplus of labor in job market A, you could switch to job market B. You could change whatever skills it is that you're offering. You could pivot. I just came from Pruis Hall, where a bunch of professors were talking about the college business and internship opportunities and what each major has to offer. And we didn't get to the question, but one of the questions that had been prepared for was, should you get a second major? And in general, I typically say, Right? When you graduate, the main thing that people are going to look at is, did you graduate? Do you have that sheepskin? That's the number one thing. You might want to get a double major, though, as a method of diversifying your portfolio. In the same way that you want to have a diverse portfolio of financial assets that you're holding on to, you might want to diversify the portfolio of skills that you're offering to the market. So if you do get a double major, what should it be in? Something as different from your first major as you can possibly stand, that also is marketable. So what would be the extreme opposite of economics? Maybe playing the violin, right? I don't know, but something very different. I don't know if playing the violin is marketable. Okay, so being prepared to switch skills can be valuable. I had a friend who was a computer programmer during the dot-com era, and the dot-com bubble came through, and he became unemployed. He started an HVAC company, made a ton of money. Right? Do you need a college degree to do HVAC? No, but he had one. Didn't do him any good anymore. Okay. One of the things that comes up is, in a job market, what if there is a wage that is above the market clearing wage, but it is held in place by regulations? What do we call that? A minimum wage, right? A minimum wage. What do economists have to say about minimum wages? A lot of things. They have a lot of things to say about minimum wages. The first thing to note about minimum wages, okay, let's continue with the idea of supply being inelastic, is that if this were the minimum wage, would there be a problem? No. A minimum wage set below equilibrium wage is not binding. It doesn't actually affect anybody, does it? Not really. So then, if a government has a minimum wage over its jurisdiction, and it's below the market clearing wage, it won't affect anybody at all. What if over time, the market grows, productivity increases, such that the demand for labor increases? What might happen? Well, the local politicians might say, you know what we need to do? We need to raise the minimum wage. What happened? Did raising the minimum wage increase unemployment? No, because you raised it, but it's still below the binding minimum wage. Are you with me? So this happens oftentimes. When we see policies that increase the minimum wage, oftentimes it doesn't make any difference because the market wage has already proceeded ahead of that. If, though, the minimum wage were set above the market clearing wage, we should expect to see unemployment. How many people get paid minimum wage? Yes?
I think less than 2% or so.
That's about right. Very, very few people are actually getting paid minimum wage in whatever job they have. What might be a more interesting question is, how many people would be willing to work for less than the minimum wage but can't? Okay. Those are the people that are unemployed as a result of the minimum wage. I'd like to tell a story about, how much of this do I want to talk about? Okay, let me just briefly go through the fact that in economics there is still wide-ranging disagreement about what is mostly agreed upon is that minimum wages tend to make it more difficult for young people who have no skills to find jobs. The story I like to tell about that goes like this. Right? I don't know, did any of you have any for intro macro? I think some of you might have. You have a house, and you want to build a fence around your house. So you go looking in the market for fence builders, and there's two companies that you find that are willing to build your fence. One is Bob's Best Fence, and the other is Three Guys and the Come Along. A come along is the machine that you use to pull tight a chain link fence. Okay. Bob's Best is going to charge you $180 to build the fence. He has all the modern equipment. He can do it all by himself in a day. One dude. He owns all the right machines to get it done. And he's really a pro. He can get it done. And he's going to charge you $180 for it. Right? The Three Guys that come along aren't that experienced. They're new. They're not really good at it. And so they're in the market, but they're charging, let's see. They're going to charge $55 each, such that the total price is $165. I think my math is right there. Now, what can Bob do? Can he compete with these guys? He could try to lower his price and compete. Does he want to do that? No. So he goes to his local congressman and he says, I just noticed these guys are working really hard. All of them working hard. But they're only making $55 a day. Right? These guys are slaving. And those are my fellow fence building brothers. I feel a camaraderie with them. And I think it's just a total shame that they're out there building fences all day and only making $55 a day. There ought to be a law. There ought to be a law that no man should have to be out there building fences all day long for only $55 a day. Instead, let's get them a higher living wage. Let's make sure that they each get paid $70 a day. And make it a law that nobody can be paid less than $70 a day for building fences. There's the minimum wage. Now what does Bob do? Well, now Bob can raise his price to $205 and get all the business. Because these guys are each getting paid $70 a day, they have to charge $210 altogether, and he can raise his price to $205. When the minimum wage was first put in place, it was a program designed by people who wanted to push immigrants, blacks, women, and children out of the market. They wanted to make it harder for people like that to get jobs so that white men could get more jobs and get higher wages. Right? There's a whole book called Illiberal Reformers by Thomas Leonard, all about how this worked out. I'm going to post one of the chapters from that book that talks about how this basically starts out. That's the basics of unemployment, minimum wages. We'll talk a little bit about solo starting Monday. Questions for me? No? Well, hot damn if I didn't finish on time. Thank you.